Cup of Culture. My name is Kim Berry-Jones, and I'm the director of the Center for Justice and Reconciliation. And we're super thrilled to have you here tonight. And as we launch into this evening, I would like to pause and say a prayer. So please join me in prayer. God, we come to you tonight with expectant hearts, and we ask that you meet us here in these moments, God, that you give us courage and boldness to look at our whiteness if we are wearing white skin. And God, we ask for the protection of hearts for our brothers and sisters for my brothers and sisters of color tonight as they join in this conversation. And we're so thankful for this community that's fostering this kind of dialogue. And we thank you for how you've brought all of this together, and we do all of this in your name, God. Amen. So welcome to Cup of Culture. We are so glad you're here. This night has been in the making since last January, when Sam and I met to talk about how we might be able to partner to foster conversation on campus around diversity and justice. And of course, at that time, we had no idea that we'd be sitting here on Zoom tonight, nor did we know that we would be in what I really see as an awakening and a reckoning in our nation around issues of racism. So we decided that as we worked on this project, that it made sense to start around race and unpacking that subject a little. And so as Sam and I talked, this idea came together, and then with the help of our teams, Rihanna Contreras and Lauren Woods, the Cup of Culture series came to life. And in the middle of all that, Sam and I have been getting to know each other and have been continuing our personal conversation about anti-racism and what that really means to live and move in a posture of anti-racism. And I have been looking at what that means for me as a white woman to unpack my whiteness. And it is complicated and difficult. And I feel like I fall on my face and mess up all the time, but I have committed to continuing to get up and to keep listening and to keep learning and to keep trying to do better. And so tonight, as we navigated the summer and were in conversation, we felt it was really important to start Cup of Culture with this particular conversation around race. And Sam's going to address that a little bit in a minute. But just to let you know, Cup of Culture is a collaboration between the Center for Justice and Reconciliation and Mosaic. And we are really excited about this year and getting together monthly to look at how systemic injustice is woven into our lives and how we can have meaningful and sometimes really difficult conversations and create space for us to grapple with some really challenging topics and to explore not only our identity and to understand the experience of others, but to look at the oppression in our system, and then to ultimately our goal being to work together towards living a more just life together. So Cup of Culture's monthly events will be doing just that. We'll be fostering conversation every month on a different topic, and we're doing that in 3 ways each time: through what we're calling curated content, expert speakers, and facilitated conversations. So doing this together with Multicultural and International Student Services and Mosaic and the CJR, we are super excited about Cup of Culture. So Sam, I'm going to kick it off to you to tell a little bit more about what the year's going to look like.
Thank you, Kim. I really appreciate that. So as Kim said, we met and we decided to kind of have this serious conversation about coming together, having this collaborative spirit between two offices, and talk about how can we reach the constituents that we've been sort of called to engage in. So after a serious conversation and emails and phone calls back and forth, we kind of came up with our teams, came up with this list of things that we're gonna be kind of tackling this this school year, and the first thing is obviously today talk about race, unpacking whiteness, and I'll talk more about that later. Next month we'll be talking about human trafficking and the diversity of exploitation. I think it's a very interesting topic and a very apropos living in San Diego. I think we all know the numbers and the data on the human trafficking that goes through this city. And then we're gonna talk about gender stereotype. We're gonna talk about what it means to be feminine, what it means to be masculinity, and all that. So, and then in January, when we during our January break, we're gonna be tackling criminal justice system. And then in February, we're gonna have a very special one focused more to faculty and staff, where we're gonna kind of revisit this conversation we're gonna have today on race. And then we're gonna move on, talk about immigration and DACA and mental health, and then end it in May with youth without a home and homelessness. So I am super excited for this event. I'm very excited for this collaboration. So kind of to turn to what we're gonna be doing today, we chose this particular topic, race, unpacking whiteness. And obviously I'm not white, so I'm not one of the experts people today, but I think it's extremely important for us as a community to realize that we cannot have this conversation without our white counterparts in this space. So, I've had some people ask me, why is it that, why are we talking about whiteness, and why are we talking about this, and why do we have more people of color kind of talk about this? And my idea, my answer to them is, well, first of all, the burden of education is not on people of color to educate us and to let us know how it is to live an anti-racist life. And so I'm trying to make sure that we truly understand that it's not up to the Black and brown people among us to teach us that. And then also, I believe that if we're constantly making people of color talk about this issue, what we are actually doing is we're perpetuating this stereotype that diversity and racism and anti-racism is only a people of color issue. And that kind of give a pass to white people to say, well, that's not me, that's not about me. And that's definitely something that I do not want to see, especially on this campus. I don't want our white brothers and sisters to feel like, or to think this is not about them, and they can't talk about it, and this is not their problem. It is all of our problem, and something that I think we need to figure. And then lastly, this is something personally to me. Whenever I feel like, or whenever someone asks me, what should I do? Tell me about how you've been discriminated against. I always feel like I'm reliving the same issue, the same discrimination I went through. And that comes with a lot of emotional toll. So all of these reasons are reasons enough for us to say, you know what? There are times and there are days where let's have white people talk about how they're feeling. How are you dealing with this? How are you dealing with these uncomfortable feelings and uncomfortable situations, instead of people of color coming in and talking about that? So that's really why we're here. We are really here to kind of hear that. We're here to listen to someone who lived this life, a white man who lived this life and know this. So it's my honor to really present a guy I just met, and having conversations with him, I feel like he is ready to lead this conversation. His name is, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, is Jer Swigert. I think I said that right. He's one of the co-founders of the Global Immersion Project. It's a peacemaking training organization which is dedicated to cultivating an everyday peacemaking movement that is seeking to remake our divided world, right? So he said, as a modern day peacemaker, Jer has found himself contending for peace in beautifully bizarre corners of our global village. Whether in the tribes of northern Pakistan, the slums of India, the red light districts of Southeast Asia, the conflicted regions of Israel and Palestine, and the borderlines between US and Mexico, or the racial divides within his own neighborhood. He lives, loves, and leads in a way that disarms violence and awakens imagination. So, there's a lot about him, and I really encourage you to seek out his organization and read more about what he does. You can go to Google and type in the Global Immersion Project. Amazing work him and his team are doing. But before we kind of invite him on, we have a short curated video that we're going to show you to kind of set the stage a little bit for us today. So Jer hosted a few webinars with friends of his earlier this summer, and they compiled. He has given us some snippets of videos that we're going to show to you. You're going to hear from Andre Henry, who's a writer, musician, and prophetic leader of social change and racial justice, and Oshita Moore, who's an author, podcaster, economic justice advocate for women. So you're going to hear from them. I really encourage you to listen intently. And, if you can take notes. I know some of you are getting chapel credits for this. Take note and really listen. And then after the video, Jared's going to come up and then talk to us. And then after he talked to us, we're going to open it up, and we want to hear your questions. We want to hear your thoughts, your critiques, whatever it is you have on your mind. We want to have a conversation today. I also want to end with, this is not a one-time thing. We're not going to do this and then close the book and say, we're done. Point Loma is now an anti-racist campus and we get it now. No, far from it. This is just the first step to a lot of steps coming. And so between CJR and Mosaic, we're going to be coming up with more events kind of centered around this conversation. And we're also going to open up spaces for our students of color to really speak up about how they feel about how the white students are reacting to this. So I'm going to turn it over to our video people to show the videos. Thank you.
My ministry and my leadership is figuring out like how to help people in their ordinary everyday lives be peacemakers. But then my work kind of turned as a Black woman. If I was writing this book and I was realizing I can't say that I'm seeking shalom with God, because I think of shalom multi-directional between me and God, within myself, with others, in my context, and then systems of the world. Mm-hmm. And I realized I couldn't seek shalom with God unless I was very comfortable in this brown body. And as I became really comfortable with my body and who God made me to be, I recognized that there was so much brokenness in the world that is constantly telling me there's something wrong with this body. And white supremacy and racism became a part of my language and my mission of dismantling, because that's a space where we see a great need for shalom. So that for me kind of built this, it had me asking God this question of what would it look like to have an invitational approach to the racial reconciliation conversation that invited white people in, saying, listen, here's the deal. Oppression affects the oppressor and the oppressed. Broken systems affect all people, and there's a brokenness that all of us experience. And while my specific brokenness looks like my son gets called the N-word at school, I'm followed when I am in the grocery store, men that look like my father and brother are choked on the street or shot down while they're running, and that's how this broken system affects me. But this broken system affects white people too. There's a defensiveness, there's a shame, there's a guilt, there's a lack of empathy or humility. Like the system affects white people too. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to, and for me, the best way to be a peacemaker towards them was to approach them with a posture of peace and say, we're both broken, and how do we work together towards wholeness?
When you're talking about race, whiteness, race, racism, and whiteness. Let's all make sure that we're talking about. I want to be using your definition when we're talking about this stuff.
Yeah, so I think that it's important to understand this historically, right? Like there's a story about race that has a beginning. We usually don't think about that, where many of us are brought up in the world, and I was too, as though race had always been a way that people thought about themselves, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways like a biological fact. But race is not a biological fact, you know? Race wasn't like an official category in a way that people began to think about themselves until around the Enlightenment period, mm-hmm. when people started talking about humanity in a different way. And the way that Europeans in the Enlightenment started talking about humanity was in the sense of a hierarchy, that there are some humans that are better than others. And these stories were utilized to justify the violence of the transatlantic slave trade and of the age of conquest. So like, I hear people talk about how racism comes from hate. And I love how the scholar Dr. Ibram Kendi, in his book Stand from the Beginning, he makes the point that race and racism don't come from hate, but that they come from self-interest primarily. That these European folks, they wanted the land in North America and they took it through violence. And the story that they told about that was, well, these people are not human like we are. So these race categories begin to emerge around that time, with Europeans talking about, it was color-coded, basically, right? That white, able-bodied Christian men are, did I mention? Yeah, white, straight, able-bodied Christian men. Mm-hmm. They are at the top of this human hierarchy. And then the darker you get, the less human you are until you get to black, which is the non-human. So I talk about race as a technology instead of a biological fact, because it's something that was created for a purpose by human beings and utilized by human beings. And I guess that's a good segue into racism, right? Mm-hmm. Racism is the system that is based on the social political category of race, right? Racism is the Jim Crow laws of the South, you know, that followed slavery. It is the slave trade itself, with the ships and the papal bulls that were written to justify the conquest of the so-called New World. Like, racism is the expression of that anti-Black violence, right? It's about power, basically, is what I'm saying. Racism is that system, and are those structures that allow those people who put themselves at the top of the human hierarchy to express that hierarchy in policy, in their social decisions, in their behaviors. And just one more point on that. And this is so important, because when we talk about racism, people think that we're just talking about individual acts of hate or emotional, like your emotional disposition toward other people. And there are great words for that kind of stuff, like prejudice and bigotry and all the kind of stuff. Those things count, they're bad, but they're not all racism. Racism is that event in 1964 where these two white Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee activists, along with one Black activist, go out to investigate a church bombing. They are arrested by the police, and the police release those young men to the Ku Klux Klan that night. They let them out in the night so that the Ku Klux Klan can get them. That's racism, because it's not just hatred for Black people, it's the ability to lynch with impunity. It's the ability to know that if you were to kill one of your neighbors, that you're going to sit down in front of a group of your peers and they will not convict you and they will not indict you. It's the system backing it up.
Yeah.
So that is all. So I think that it's important for people to understand that when we talk about racism as a kind of system of power or a relationship of power, that we understand that whiteness is actually essential to this idea. Because oftentimes when we talk about racism, we automatically go to talking about why do black people suffer so much? Instead of thinking about the consequences of some people truly buying into the ideology of white supremacy. And it's easiest for those who are categorized as white to buy into the ideology of white supremacy. I mean, non-white people do as well, but it's easier for those who would benefit most from it. Like to be anti-racist means to be actively against racism. Mm-hmm. Because what most people are doing right now is they're taking the worst example of racism and saying, well, I'm not a racist because I'm not that, you know? Mm-hmm. So white people in the South, where I grew up, say, I'm not a racist. I'm not a part of the Klan. I've never lynched a black person in my life. And then Northern white people say, well, I'm not racist. I'm not from the South.
Right.
And then European white people say, I'm not racist. I'm not American.
Right.
But so this is all people trying to be non-racist. Mm-hmm. Instead, what I try to encourage people to do is to first off accept you were born in a world where racism was already a thing and race was already a thing. You were born into a world that was built on anti-black ideas. It's like being born after the invention of the iPhone. Like, it's here, you know? Like, you just have to accept that that's a part of your world. And because you live in an anti-black society or a world that's been built on anti-black ideas, it's likely that you've ingested some of those. And it's also likely that you might have even repeated some of them. You might have even acted out of them, you know? I know so many well-meaning white people who, you know, they're like, I don't have a racist bone in my body. Mm-hmm. But the moment that their white daughter brought a black man home as their boyfriend, now that hits closer to home for them somehow. And now they have to confront some ideas and some feelings that they didn't even realize that they were holding. Now, as an anti-racist, we lean into that moment. We say, wait, why do I feel that way? You know? And we want to examine that, we want to track it down so that we can do differently. So I want to just throw that out there too, as I'm talking about whiteness, that this can be very triggering for people who their entire lives have been called white and identified themselves as white people, that there's a difference between being identified as white and truly believing all of the stuff that comes with whiteness as it was invented through the Enlightenment. But the vestiges of those ideas are still with us. The ideas about black people being non-human, being super strong, overly sexual, not as intelligent, not as beautiful, prone to criminality, violent, aggressive, all of those ideas are still with us. And those ideas are essential to whiteness. They're a tandem deal.
One of the things I want to raise up before we move on to the conversation, though, is the distinction that you make between white people and whiteness. Mm-hmm. And I want you to lift that to the surface a little bit more. I think Andre helped us a couple of weeks ago talking about whiteness, not from a biological point of view, you know, and but when you talk about it in the realm of powers and principalities, it's a thing that we can actually link arms and take on together. So talk a little bit more about why the distinction between whiteness and white people is actually so important in the message that you're actually, that you embody and are leaning into with us.
Yeah. So here's the deal. You as a white person, your shame and your white guilt doesn't help. it does not move the dial forward at all. It does not create shalom. It doesn't create shalom within yourself, and it definitely doesn't create shalom or peace between you and me. And what I feel like is when we conflate the system of whiteness or the system of white supremacy, or we attach all of our hatred and anger and frustration with that system, when we attach it to people, that causes our white brothers and sisters to have to navigate a tremendous amount of shame and a tremendous amount of guilt. And it creates a foothold, like scripture says, for the enemy of bitterness and resentment. And they don't have the stamina. You don't have the stamina to continue doing this work, because if the only narrative that you get is that because you're a white person, there's something intrinsically wrong with you because of something that happened, that because of the fallout of white supremacy, then you're no help to me. Because if you don't believe that you have a unique calling and a unique capacity in doing this work because of shame, then you're taken out of this work. And I need white people to know where they are and who they are called to be, and to step into that. So the importance for me is saying whiteness is this structure. Whiteness is this thing. It is fueled by white supremacy. And so how do we have a conversation about that? But then you are a person who happens to be white, or you are a person who God made to be white. And God didn't make a mistake in making you white, Jer. God didn't make a mistake in making you white, John. Like, nobody white on this call, God was like, oops, I meant to make them something else. Like, you are white, and God did not make a mistake in that. You happen to be a white person in a social location, in a world that gives you certain benefits and says that you don't have to really worry about race. And so what the distinction for me is, I need you to know that there's nothing wrong with you being a white person. And I need you to know that you are beloved in your white skin. This is one of the reasons why I really love Dr. King's vision for the beloved community that is built on nonviolence, that we are not going to have nonviolent words or thoughts towards each other. And if I think there's something wrong with you because you're white, that's me having a violent thought and posture towards you. And I also need you to know you're beloved. I need you to feel comfortable in your white skin just as much as I need to feel comfortable in my brown skin, so that we can honor the Imago Dei in each other, dignify each other, and resist all of those forces that are constantly taking the lives of brown and black people and violating their image, their Imago Dei. And so that distinction is so important for me, because if I don't have the trust of a white person to say, I believe that you are good in your white skin, and I believe that you are beloved in your white skin, but because you're white, there are all these things I need you to be aware of, and I need you to rise up as a peacemaker, I feel like that's a more empowering way and a more invitational way, again. Because I don't have time, honestly, real talk, I don't have time to sit and wade through a whole lot of shame and guilt. I need for us to own our belovedness.
America's collective imagination, Black people are dangerous. That was constructed in the early 1900s, after slavery, to legitimate the Black codes and Jim Crow and pig law and convict leasing and all the other stuff that came after slavery, right? And so Black people are policed as though we are inherently dangerous. But the truth is that the fact that people think these things about Black people makes them dangerous. That makes them dangerous for us. And so white people need to police one another the way that white people usually police Black people. Mm. White people need to police themselves, their own thoughts, their own attitudes, so that they can be weeding out, because just like you said, like I've tried to say, like, the fruit of this tree is blood, right? It is the hanging, the shooting, the choking, the beating to death of Black bodies. But the seed of it is way more subtle. Mm-hmm. And I think that it does begin with white people checking each other sometimes. And just asking each other, saying like, well, why did you feel like you needed to interject into that conversation?
Kind of talk to us a bit around like, who do we need to become as white folk? Because our learning curve, I think, is a lot steeper with regard to whiteness than yours is.
Yeah.
And so, can you talk a little bit around like what do you see as the work that white folk need to do in order to grow in fluency of their whiteness?
Well, I think the first thing that white people need to do is they need to get really comfortable with being uncomfortable. That is the very first thing that I think is the first obstacle that I experience, that I notice a lot of white people go through, is that discomfort. If you don't allow yourself to feel that discomfort and to talk through that discomfort and to get on the other side of it, then you will always stop. And so maybe you'll just read one book, and that book felt really, really uncomfortable for you, and you don't ever want to read another book, or you don't ever want to watch another documentary, or you said something in a meeting and somebody critiqued you, and now you're like, I don't ever want to do that again. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I am so frustrated with seeing so many people who are willing to like go to CrossFit, but they're not willing to do the hard work of like being uncomfortable to talk about race and understanding their social location. And so I think the very first thing is like, okay, this is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. And I think being okay with that, I mean, that is cross-shaped love. That is cruciform love. Like the love of Jesus was on the cross, made himself uncomfortable for us. And so being a white person, doing this work, you just got to know that it's going to be hard. And I think that's why that belovedness piece is so incredibly important, because if you know that no matter what, you are completely loved by God, and that this isn't a referendum on your goodness or your value or your worth, but you are stepping into this hard thing, I think that is incredibly important.
You brought up a concept a little bit ago that I think is really important, and I want you to weigh a bit more on. It's this idea of shame resilience, and white people growing their resilience, not just for discomfort, but for shame, like the shame of and the guilt and all those things. Talk to us, if you would, just briefly about what you mean by that, and how would you exhort us to grow in our resilience with regard to shame?
Yeah. So when I say shame resilience, that's not with me. I know Brene Brown uses that often, and she picked it up in her work, in her research. And so when I say shame resilience around this issue right here, the very first thing is I need you to not feel bad about being white. Like I really need for you to not feel bad about that. And because in my work, I have found that I have had to do a whole lot of unpacking of that. Like, okay, you're not bad because you're white, just like I'm not bad because I'm Black. And kind of so that's probably the first thing of building a shame resilience. And then the other thing is that just because you did something bad or you said something wrong, we're all going to say wrong things. I'm pretty sure I've maybe said something that has offended somebody or rubbed somebody the wrong way. Like, we're all going to make mistakes on this journey. The trust that we build with each other is our willingness to be vulnerable and making those mistakes with each other, and then saying, okay, what did we learn from that? Kind of like the 4 questions that you asked. What did you hear? Like, what did we learn from that? And what are we going to do next? And knowing that that's your process, that you're going to say, okay, I totally used the wrong word, or I totally shared the wrong information about this shooting or whatever. Okay, well, I made a mistake and I'm going to move forward. There's one pastor in this area who posted something and it was not helpful at all. And it caused a whole lot of conflict in her comment section. She came to me and 4 other Black leaders and said, can you read this response that I'm going to write in response to the thing that I did? That is shame, resilience, and action. Yeah. She was like, you know what? I'm going to go back to the white people that are following me and say, I did this thing wrong, but hey, like, here is what I'm learning, and here's what I'm doing, and here's where I'm going next with it, so that I don't do the wrong thing again, and just be really transparent. And I think that for me, is what shame resilience looks like. It's just, this is going to be hard, but you're going to just walk through the hardness and not beat up on yourself in the process.
Hold on while we get Jer unmuted. There he goes.
You with me? Can you hear me now? Those were two riveting conversations with dear friends of mine, and both Ashita and Andre have been accompanying me for a long time in my personal journey in becoming an anti-racist peacemaker. And part of that for me has very much so been waking up to this idea, this concept, this construct of whiteness. And so that's the conversation that I want to segue into now, kind of out of where those two conversations went. Before I get going, though, I really want to begin this evening in honor and memory of Breonna Taylor. And I'm mindful of just yesterday, the fact that the city of Louisville made a $12 million settlement to her family for the unjust execution of their daughter, Breonna. And I'm moved by this moment, because while that is restitution, that is not justice, and that is not reconciliation, and it's not restoration. I think it's a step in the journey. And so I'm mindful of Breonna and Breonna's family. I see her as another soul in a large and unfortunately growing constellation of Black lives that have been prematurely extinguished by whiteness in the last 3 months, for sure, but also in the last 400 plus years here in this soil. As Sam alluded to earlier, my name is Jer Swigart, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Global Immersion Project. I call Bend, Oregon home, and the reason that that's significant is because Bend is 87% white. And so as we begin to have this conversation about whiteness, and as you're considering the moment where we're going to be able to do some Q&A in the aftermath of this, conversations around what it means to do the work of anti-racism in predominantly white spaces, I think is an important conversation. I'm not sure how much we'll get into it in the conversation, but as I go and as I share some thoughts, as questions surface for us, I don't know exactly the demographics of Point Loma and Nazarene University, but I think you're a predominantly white space. And so doing this work, becoming anti-racist peacemakers in the context of whiteness is important for us to be thinking about. And I will share some thoughts in that regard. I was also born and raised among the dairy farms and the military forts and bases of the Midwest. And while my learning curve on race and racism, whiteness and anti-racism has really accelerated in the last 15 years, I give credit to my grandmother, my parents, and 3 childhood BIPOC friends as catalyzing me into a lifelong journey. I think a necessary pilgrimage of becoming becoming an anti-racist. My grandmother was the daughter of a Klansman, and she made the radical decision to escape the prisons of hatred and to choose a life that was as diametrically opposed to her dad's way of life as possible. That meant that she began a learning journey. She became someone who was adept at building uncommon friendships and eventually became an anti-racist ally in a time in our period of history where that was life-threatening to do so. My parents, I give my parents credit for the relationship that they cultivated with the Williams, which was a Black family in Mississippi. And my relationship with the Williams family, with Big Ma and Suge, exposed me to the realities of chattel slavery and sharecropping, and the idea, the reality that my experience as a white male in America is very, very different than those who do not look like me. 3 childhood BIPOC friends dared to cross diverse thresholds into my life, and therefore taught me how to cross diverse thresholds into the lives of others. And literally the journey that I'm on right now, I give them the credit for catalyzing me into, and I wouldn't be who I am today without that. One last preamble here before we dive into a conversation about whiteness. And this first word is to my white siblings in this space. Conversation, I don't know what it was that actually drew you into this conversation. I wish that I, in my undergraduate years, would have been able to have access to conversations like these. What a gift that you get to be a part of this. In the moment that we find ourselves in, when we're talking about race, racism, whiteness, and anti-racism, oftentimes it becomes a very uncomfortable conversation for white folk. And so in this moment, that I want to acknowledge that this conversation is going to be pretty uncomfortable, and it's on purpose, because our transformation actually demands discomfort. I have never substantively become a different kind of person in a way that was easy. It has always required discomfort and pain. And what we've been groomed as white folk to do is when something gets too uncomfortable, we've actually been discipled, trained, groomed to see discomfort as something wrong, something bad is happening, and we need to distance ourselves from that as quickly as possible. I think we've been duped. I think that transformation doesn't happen in the space of comfort and safety. Transformation happens through the discomfort and on the other side of it. And so as this conversation unfolds, when you feel the stirrings of discomfort or disorientation, I'm going to invite you just to simply identify it, write it down. Maybe there was a word, a phrase, an idea that really triggered you and made you uncomfortable. Go ahead and write that down so that we can do the work of self-analysis and self-interrogation in the aftermath of this conversation. So I'm going to call my white siblings to some bravery. I'm going to call us to some resilience. I'm going to call you to dig deep and move into the discomfort because our preference for comfort is costing the lives of way too many people. To my BIPOC relatives in the space, I want to thank you for entering into it. I'm humbled that you would actually carve out some time to be here, to listen in and to watch this conversation. I want to thank you for the ways in which you have tirelessly contended for our transformation, and for the ways, I think Oshita said it so beautifully, that our transformation, our restoration, our liberation is intrinsically tied to one another. And so thank you for listening in on this. And if nothing else, maybe this conversation will create some common language for the 111 or so people who are on this call to take the next steps in the wake of this conversation. To all of us, I encourage us not to see this as just chapel credit or hopefully an entertaining conversation, but that we see this moment as a tool of our own transformation. I think that will make this hour beneficial. I want to acknowledge that I'm in the process of awakening, that I in no way, shape, or form have arrived. I am very sensitive to the idea of wokeness. I feel like it's a destination. That destination feels like a myth or mirage to me. I want to be a lifelong learner who is ever in the process of awakening. I want to lift up the fact that my awakening is coming, yes, through literature, yes, through following online personalities, but more importantly, through uncommon experiences and meaningful relationships. Some of the most transformative work in my life has been as I've found myself submitting to the leadership and the mentorship of especially my Black sisters and brothers who are teaching me what it means to be a white man in America. And so I'm in the process of awakening. My learning curve is steep, and I imagine that it will always be steep. The reason I raise this up is because I want us to always be in the process of becoming better versions of ourselves. And I want us to have the kind of infrastructure around us, especially talking to my white siblings. We need to have infrastructure around us that contributes to our becoming all the time. And so I am awakening. I will always be awakening. The things that I say in this space, I might say differently 3 or 4 months from now. You're getting me where I am here in this particular moment. I want to acknowledge that a preference for whiteness has been ingrained into my body, into my mind, into my eyes, that whiteness shapes the way that I see myself, that I notice others, and that I understand the world that I navigate. I want to acknowledge that whiteness is the wedge that has propped open every single door of opportunity before I ever darkened the threshold. That 1,000 years before I walked through any door of opportunity, that door was already propped open for me by whiteness. I want to acknowledge that whiteness is a set of lenses through which I read and relate and reason. I want to acknowledge that not so long ago, whiteness is what caused white Christians to pack picnics so that they could catch the lynching of a Black body after a church service. That whiteness is the disease that caused 2 men to follow and interrogate and then execute Ahmaud Arbery in February. Whiteness is the demon that you see in the eyes of Officer Derek Chauvin as he knelt on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That whiteness is the demon that produced the no-knock warrant that caused Louisville police to break into somebody's home and kill an innocent person while she was sleeping in her bed. That the violence of whiteness that I want to talk about here this evening is not only located in those who enact those kinds of physical violence. The violence of whiteness is also found in my ignorance. It's found in my indifference. It's found in my apathy, and it's found in my silence. I would add one more, that whiteness is found in my quibbling about things. There are real realities that are happening in my world that whiteness tells me to quibble about them and completely distract myself and others from the issue at hand, the lethal, life-threatening or life-saving issues that are actually at hand. Whiteness is found in the systems and structures that we inhabit in our everyday lives, our families, our faith communities, our university campuses, our neighborhoods, and our workplaces. And so the reason I'm bringing up whiteness, and I want to define our term here in a second. The reason I'm lifting up whiteness is because I think a major misconception in our country right now with regard to a country divided by race is that racism is a Black issue or a BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color issue. When in reality, racism is a white issue. And I want to lift up whiteness as an issue that I would argue has been the greatest threat to the supremacy of Christ and to the flourishing of humanity for at least the last 400 years and far beyond. And so to begin to grow fluent in whiteness, how whiteness expresses itself, how whiteness informs the way that I read, relate, and reason, how whiteness shapes the way that I benefit from the very systems that are crushing people who don't like me. We have to grow in our fluency of this if we're actually going to be a part of any kind of alliances or remaking of the world that we live in. And so I do want to spend a little bit of time defining our terms, race, racism, and whiteness in particular. And these are the definitions that you heard Andre working through a little bit in that clip leading into this. And but he and I have now worked together to firm them up a little bit more, because we want to, when we're talking about race, racism, and whiteness, we want people to understand how we're defining these terms. That's really super important, especially in, I think, a chaotic and confusing moment that we find ourselves in. So race, according to Andre and I, is an unnatural hierarchy of humanity designed by powerful European men to accumulate and protect their interests. Again, race is an unnatural hierarchy of humanity designed by powerful European men to accumulate and protect their interests most notably being wealth, power, and safety. Racism, therefore, is the weaponizing of race in order to systemically oppress non-white people. The weaponizing of race in order to systemically oppress non-white people. And then whiteness is a socially constructed standard upon which every person is measured and deemed normal, unusual, foreign, exotic, or not fully human. So whiteness is the top of the human hierarchy. With whiteness, ethnicity is optional, privilege is automatic, violence is inevitable and acceptable, and ignorance is essential. And so, like, I think it's important when we recognize, and this is where I love what Andre said, either in this clip or further in the comment. Yeah, he said it in this clip, is that whiteness is not a biological reality. Whiteness is a technology. He named whiteness as a technology. Why? Because a technology is something created by humans to make something more efficient. And in this case, whiteness is a technology created by powerful European men to make the accumulation of our self-interests more efficient. And so that's the way that we're talking about these three realities, specifically whiteness. I'm going to copy and paste this note and pop it in the comment thread right here, so maybe you can see. Oops, maybe I did that to Rihanna. Rihanna, you can pass it along to others. I'm going to make the argument tonight that the world we live in is a world made by whiteness, that whiteness has shaped our faith and has also shaped our Jesus. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but ultimately, in order to justify living in a world that whiteness has made, we white folk have constructed a white Jesus who endorses our accumulation of abundance, power, and safety. I'm going to actually argue that that's an illegitimate Jesus, and the following of that Jesus is costing us our souls and the lives of our BIPOC relatives. So how did we get here? How do we get to this moment where we're living in a world so made by whiteness? We're living in this racially divided moment. We're living in this moment where lots and lots and lots of white American Christians are saying, like, what really, do we have a race problem? I just read a Barna poll yesterday that said that right now, 38% of practicing white Christians think that we have a race problem in America. So how did we get to a place where we live in a world made by whiteness, a faith that's made by whiteness, a Jesus that's been constructed by whiteness, and then a group of white American Christians who are like, I don't necessarily even see that race is a problem in our country. The majority of white American Christians saying, we don't think it's a problem. How did we get here? I'm going to spend some time doing some history, a little bit of theology, and then I want to offer a bit of a roadmap forward, and then we'll have some conversation about all of this. So let's rewind the clock and bear with me, because I'm going to go through like 2,000 years of history in like 6 minutes. Time me. 1620, we have the Pilgrims, right? Black caps, the turkeys with the Indians on Plymouth Rock, all this or that. 1620, the Pilgrims. Now, the Pilgrims believed that the Church of England was domineering, controlling, and beyond reform. And so they fled what they saw as religious persecution, and they arrived to what our indigenous peoples referred to as Turtle Island. Now, in our myths of this particular moment in American history, we like to celebrate their rebellion. We love their pioneering spirit. We love their rugged individualism. We congratulate their Christianity and actually have this, like, we elevate their zeal for religious freedom, which is something that is kind of a buzzword in our world right now, the sense of religious freedom. What we fail to acknowledge with the Pilgrims is that they came carrying the doctrines of manifest destiny and white supremacy borrowed from the popes that were baptized as Christian faithfulness. So with manifest destiny and white supremacy, this is the theology, the ideology that was already inside these white British Christians when they washed up on our colonial shores. They believed that Christian faithfulness looked like the violent conquering of new to them territories and the peoples who inhabited the territory, right? Because with manifest destiny, this idea that God has this special place set aside for white Christian people, and white supremacy, this idea of human hierarchy that says that white is superior and it goes down in value all the way to blackness at the very bottom. This idea that we can actually conquer and take what God has destined for us, even if it means the killing of all of the people who live in this particular space. That was baptized by the Pope as Christian faithfulness. They also carried with them these economic theories that justified the enslavement of darker-hued image bearers in order to build their future and their wealth. So manifest destiny, white supremacy, and slave-based capitalism are the ideologies that are already ingrained in these white British Christians who wash up on the shores of Turtle Island, which means that the white Christianity that planted its foot onto Turtle Island was a greedy, racist, violent, imperial religion that did not reflect the nonviolent, enemy-loving, cross-wearing God we see in Jesus. Big statement. I'm arguing, based on the ideologies and the theologies that the Pilgrims adhered to, that the white Christianity that planted its foot on Turtle Island was a greedy, racist, violent, imperial religion that did not reflect the nonviolent, cross-wearing, enemy-loving God that we see in Jesus. Now, all of this didn't just happen in England in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. I'm going to argue that the seeds of white American Christianity were not planted in the 16th century England, nor on the shores of our original colonies, that the seeds were more ancient than that. So we're going to go all the way back to the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. In the wake of that, we have a community, a first century movement of people oriented around Jesus whose understanding of Imago Dei shaped their sacramental practice. That means that they believed intrinsically that me, you, all of us are made in the image of God. We are of intrinsic value. That meant that then shaped the ethic, the behavior of this group of Jesus followers, in that they lived sacrificially for fellow image bearers, not just the image bearers that were within their bloodline or their faith community or their university or their friend group. They lived sacrificially on behalf of all image bearers, including the ones that are far outside their bloodline. They did it so radically that there's a Roman historian and senator named Tacitus who critiqued Christians, saying these people apparently don't have any regard for their own lives. So committed are they to the lives and the flourishing of those outside of their group. right? So there's something sacramental. There's something about their belief, their theology that informed a radical inclusiveness, an unprecedented hospitality, an ethic of cross-shaped self-sacrifice on behalf of whoever was in front of them. Fast forward the clock a couple of hundred years, we get to the early church fathers who were imperial scholars who embraced Neoplatonism in two forms. Now get this, because I think this is really important, because this will show up in the United States. Neoplatonism in two forms. Number one, the bifurcation of the soul and the body. So the early church fathers made this argument that the soul is of intrinsic value, but the body and all of creation is consumable and disposable. It doesn't really matter that much. The second form of Neoplatonism that the early church fathers embraced was this idea of human hierarchy, that some image bearers care worth and value over and above other image bearers. And in the studies of the early church fathers, they're usually talking about men having more value than women. So you begin to see the emergence of this Christian human hierarchy take shape among the early church fathers. Fast forward just a couple of hundred years, we get to Constantine. Constantine was the Roman emperor who has this vision of a military conquest under the banner of Christianity, and has a major victory, becomes the emperor, and then paves the way for Christianity to become the imperial religion. And in that moment, the marriage of Christianity, this nonviolent, cross-shaped way of generosity and unprecedented hospitality, radical inclusion, the marriage of Christianity to politics and power required that the nonviolent movement put down the cross in order to pick up the sword, because you can't hold both. You can't hold an instrument that says our way of life is marked by self-sacrifice while also holding a sword and saying, and if you disagree, then it will cost you your life. So this moment when Christianity is married with power and politic, we put down the cross, we picked up the sword. And then if you move forward swiftly, we get into this era of the Holy Wars where imperial Christianity begins to mature, and we begin to see the fruit of an imperial Christianity that holds a sword rather than the cross. Because in the Crusades, greed demanded violence, which was justified through the ideas of human hierarchy. So there was this desire in the Crusades to protect the Holy Land and to make sure that Europe and all of the spaces was Christianized. We have to wrest it from the control of the infidels, of the Muslims, of the savages, and this or that, right? And so in the name of Christ, we picked up our swords and we engaged in violence, and we justified it through racism. We said that these people are not as human as we are. So in the Crusades, we have the birth of colonization, and we have the fine-tuning of the cultural genocides, and we baptized both of those things as Christian. Move forward a couple hundred years, we move into the age of discovery. This is the moment when European powers began to compete with one another for wealth through the domination of the planet. And again, in this case, the satisfaction of our greed demanded violence, which we justified through the construction of race, right? So if I'm going to compete, if Spain is going to compete with France for the conquest of the world, I'm going to race as quickly as I can to not just discover new lands, but to conquer it, which necessitates the genocide of the peoples who are in that space, if not the cultural genocide, the actual physical genocide of these people, so that I can establish my flag in that place, right? So greed, the satisfaction of greed demands violence, and then that violence is justified through this construct of race, that those people who live in those foreign new places are not really human at all. Again, in the age of discovery, the popes not only complied, but they baptized it. They made it doctrine. They baptized it as Christian. And so now, in the age of discovery, faithful Christian practice now included conquest through conversion, militarism, and genocide. Then we get into the Enlightenment era, 17th and 18th century intellectual movement of progress, right? And this is where race, as we formally understand it, was officially born. Race, again, a constructed hierarchy of human beings that reflected a color-coded white over black ideology. So England in this time is a part of the race for conquest. They're the new imperial power. They are the empire, the contemporary empire at that time. They begin this social construction of race that places whiteness as supreme, blackness at the very bottom. Whiteness is literally codified above all other skin tones. And in that imagery, we began to enact things like the transatlantic slave trade, and we built our fortunes based on the backs of our Black sisters and brothers, believing that they weren't actually as human as we were. It's in the midst of the Enlightenment era that the Pilgrims, black hats, turkeys with the Indians, things like that, white British Christians boarded a ship fueled with the theologies of manifest destiny, white supremacy, and slave capitalism in pursuit of their religious freedom. Which again means that the Christianity that washed up on the shores of Turtle Island in the 17th century was a greedy, racist, violent, imperial religion that did not reflect the nonviolent, enemy-loving, cross-wearing God we see in Jesus. 150 years later, Thomas Jefferson, a white American deist, penned the words in our founding documents that I think have been detrimental to our Black relatives for centuries. He wrote, and I quote, "All men are created equal." So influenced by this white American Christianity, although he probably leaned more toward a deist approach, he makes he pens into our founding documents that all men are created equal. While he's penning those words, he owned over 600 slaves and was raping some of their children. 13 years later in our Constitution, many of these same white American Christian authors who were part of building out the Declaration of Independence in our Constitution identified Black men as 3/5 human, so not really human at all. So in our founding documents, are they based on Christian ideals? Well, yes, if we consider that the Christian ideals that they're built on are not shaped by the nonviolent, enemy-loving, cross-wearing God we discover in Jesus, but rather it's a Christianity built on the imperial values of greed, racism, and violence. Now, one of my favorite authors right now is a Black historian by the name of Jamar Tisby. He wrote a book called The Color of Compromise, which I want to recommend to all of you. This is a book that talks so much about the intersection of race and white American Christianity, and it helps us understand how the church was not only complicit in elevating racism, but also in designing the institutions of our country to ensure that racism continues in a way that benefits people that look like me over and against those who do not. One of the things that Tisby says in The Color of Compromise repeatedly is that in order to get to reconciliation, let me get to his direct quote. He says, reconciliation requires forgiveness, forgiveness requires confession, and confession requires truth. In order to get to reconciliation, we, especially I'm talking to my white siblings, we have to have a reckoning with the truth of our story. And I'm imagining that much of what I just shared with you in terms of world history and the history of Christianity are things that many of us have never known before. Because part of what whiteness does is it reshapes history and gives it to us in a way that perpetuates the supremacy of whiteness and white norms and systems of racism to our benefit, because the system itself requires that we know one form of history and not a more comprehensive story. And so in order to get to reconciliation, in order to get to a world remade, in order for us as white folk to become the kinds of allies that our BIPOC relatives consider trustworthy, we have to have a reckoning with the truth of our story. And through literature, relationships, and experiences, a truth that I'm learning to reckon with is that whiteness and white supremacy has been the greatest threat to the supremacy of Christ and the flourishing of humanity for at least the last 400 years. Let me talk about the United States and how I've seen this play out. Whiteness and white supremacy is what justified our designation of Black lives as property in 1619 and then justified slavery for 246 years. Whiteness is what caused us to rename slavery through the 13th Amendment, which was just 12 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, which paved the way for convict leasing and public lynching and domestic terrorism. Whiteness generated Jim and Jane Crow policies that denied civil rights to our sisters and brothers of color until 1968. Whiteness is what took the lives of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and Fred Hampton. Whiteness is what causes our country to fight senseless wars instead of promoting and protecting the dignity of non-white Americans. Whiteness is the war on drugs that was designed to target and incarcerate Black bodies while simultaneously padding the portfolios of white folks. Whiteness is what causes us to endorse militarized law enforcement that extinguishes BIPOC lives in our streets with impunity, while at the same time causes us to delegitimize any kind of uprising if property is damaged. Whiteness is what causes us to police Black bodies and behaviors while simultaneously co-opting their culture for our own consumption. Whiteness is what causes us to endorse trillion-dollar war budgets and draconian policies that exclude those who have been terrorized by our violence from receiving the resources that they need to rebuild their lives. Whiteness is what inspires educational disparity, restricted housing covenants, voter suppression, and public lynchings by law enforcement and white vigilantes today. Whiteness is why Emmett Till and Tamir Rice and Tatiana Jefferson and Breonna Taylor are dead. And so that list is just a few of the most insidious manifestations of institutional racism in our country that haven't just been perpetuated, but have been fully endorsed by white American Christians from the moment that white American Christianity began to build a presence on the shores of this new country. And so while these forms of insidious institutional racism have been at play, the big question for me that I'm always asking as a pastor, peacemaker, and professor is, where has the white American church been? And I'm talking to us, I'm talking about white American Christianity because y'all are white American Christians. I'm talking again to my white siblings. You've been groomed in white American Christian churches. And based on the stats right now, 38% of our churches would say that, yeah, maybe there's a race problem. The rest of our churches say, no, there's not a race problem in the United States, right? So where was the white American church in the midst of all of this historically? And where are we as white American Christians now? The reason I elevate that question is because I think that's the question that Dr. King wondered from the pages of a letter that he wrote while in a Birmingham jail, right? Remember that in that letter, he's not addressing the extremists or the politicians who thrive in a racialized society. He's addressing those of us who have been groomed within a racialized faith. He's talking to white Christians. He's talking to those of us who see and either remain indifferent to or are paralyzed by the systemic oppression that continues to extinguish the lives of our BIPOC relatives. So in his speech to a group of sympathetic white politicians in 1967, maybe a lesser known speech that he gave, Dr. King lamented this. He said, "The fact is, there has never been any single solid, determined commitment on the part of the vast majority of white Americans to genuine equality for Negroes." And to my white siblings in the call, right now, we, alongside our BIPOC relatives, hold the baton of a 400-year-old abolition movement. And the question for us is, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to hold it and continue to enact the self-preservation practices that have been groomed in us from whiteness? Or are we going to engage in the self-sacrificial way of Jesus as we hold this baton, as we fight like hell for the abolition of all of us? So I'm going to imagine that those of us on this call are saying, like, I want to if I'm a part of holding the 400 years old baton of abolition, I want to steward it wisely. I want to get radical, sacrificial, restorative in the way that I do this. And so I actually want to go to the text here to help us think about a bit of a path forward. So if we've been groomed in this system, it's no surprise that many of us are sitting here confused and paralyzed. Maybe even some of us are in denial that we live in a racialized society where systems are actually being designed to oppress and occupy our BIPOC relatives. Fact of the matter is, that is true. And if we claim to follow a dark-skinned Palestinian Jew named Jesus from Nazareth, then it is impossible for us to remain indifferent to nor paralyzed toward the racialized injustice that's happening in our world. So we've been groomed to be indifferent. We hold a baton We've been saved by self-sacrifice and invited into that. What's a way forward for us? I want to talk about this in a way of both our own kind of self-analysis transformation, as well as some next steps that I think we can do in terms of moving toward our BIPOC relatives. First, I'm going to begin with a quote, because if I'm going to go to the text as followers of Jesus, I want to make sure that we're understanding the scriptures in the way that perhaps we haven't understood them before. And I'll bring up this quote. A friend of mine named Jim Bear Jacobs, who's a Mohican pastor in Minneapolis, he and I were in a conversation not too long ago, and we were talking about the scriptures. And he took the Bible at one point, and he held it out in front of me. He said, "Jared, can you tell me what this is?" And I said, "That, Jim, is the Bible." And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "You want to know what it is to me?" I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "This is an indigenous manual. This is a book written by occupied and terrorized people. This is a book written by people who are familiar with life on the underside of empire. They've experienced the whips of power, the shackles of slavery. This is a manual written by occupied and oppressed people who are trying to sort out the complexity of the God life. How do we live faithfully on the underside of empire?" He said, "You want to know what you guys have done?" Pointing to me and to some of my white friends in the conversation. He said, "You have taken this book and you've brought it to the indigenous people for hundreds of years. And you've said, 'Let me tell you what this says.'" He said, "What you should have been doing is you should have been bringing this text to us, your indigenous relatives, and asking us to help you understand what it says." When he shared that with me, it completely reframed my understanding of the scriptures. You see, for those of us who are white Christians, oftentimes we see ourselves as the protagonist in the story. We resonate with the Jesus characters, or the, or the disciples, or even the Hebrews. We, in this story, in the story of the scriptures, we are not the Hebrews. We are not the disciples. In this story, we represent the oppressor. We are the Egyptian. We are the Assyrian. We are the Babylonian. We are the Roman. We are the contemporary empire. And if that's true, then it helps us reshape how we actually engage the text. It helps us understand differently that rather than being the protagonist, I might actually be the oppressor in this regard. And so I need to listen to what Jesus is saying to the oppressor, because in this space, that's more representative of me than an occupied and oppressed person. So that's helpful. That's instructive as we move toward the scriptures here. The first passage I want to raise up, I'm just going to raise up 3 quick passages. Psalm 139:23. This is the passage where David writes, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." And there's a Black influencer that has been really important for my formation. Her name's Kimberly Crenshaw, and she really coined the term intersectionality, specifically talking about all of the multiple identities that of Black women, and how it makes Black women the most oppressed people group, at least in our country, if not the entire world. This concept of intersectionality is one for us to get really familiar with. She has a podcast called Intersectionality Matters that I would really endorse and encourage you to listen in on. They're doing a series through COVID called, and they're calling it Under the Black Light. And what I love about that is what they're trying to raise up is, in the midst of COVID, the reality of COVID in this pandemic is exposing the systems of whiteness. Like a black light, it's impossible for anything that's really, really white to be hidden. That's what the pandemic is doing. It's raising to the surface all of the systems and structures that have been made by whiteness, that have been used to actually oppress and crush our BIPOC relatives. That's what I think David is saying here or the psalmist is saying in Psalm 139, like, put my life under the black light. And as white siblings, put my life under the black light, and help me understand the parts of my life, faith, and leadership that whiteness has made that does not reflect the life and teachings of Jesus. And so I think one of the things that we can do as white folk is begin a process of self-analysis, self-interrogation. And I would encourage us to do this in community. And for those of you who actually have the benefit of trusting authentic relationships with some BIPOC sibling, this is the space where we get to invite those folk into helping us understand our blind spots. So a person in my life, his name is Ben McBride, and he's a pastor, freedom fighter up in Oakland. Ben is the kind of friend and brother in my life where he loves me enough to tell me the truth. He loves me enough to tell me when my whiteness is showing, when my patriarchy is showing. He challenges my natural intuition on things and asks me where was my intuition shaped in that regard. And so I think that God actually uses this relationship with Ben to put my life under the black light and help me understand what parts of my life whiteness has made and what parts of my life the Spirit is making and remaking. And so I think that's something that we need to do, a relentless, voracious self-analysis and self-interrogation. We have to dare to allow our lives to be critiqued, our narratives to be critiqued, our faith to be critiqued. And I think for us to do that helps us move in the right direction. Second passage I want to lift up is in Mark 10. And it's one of my favorite passages in the scriptures. Is this moment when Jesus is walking into Jericho. And what we don't know is he's about to hang out with a wee little man named Zacchaeus, right? But before he gets to Zacchaeus in the sycamore tree, Jesus is entering into Jericho, and there's a blind beggar named Bartimaeus. And the indication is that Bartimaeus has been blind his entire life. And Bartimaeus, according to the scriptures, recognizes that Jesus is walking by, and he screams at the top of his lungs, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." He's doing everything he can possibly do because he senses that the person who's walking by is the only person who could actually alter his reality. And so there's a desperation that drives Bartimaeus to make an absolute fool out of himself to get the attention of the great sight healer. And of course, everybody's like, dude, don't worry about him. He's been blind forever. He probably did something wrong, or his family did. Let's move on. Jesus stops, walks toward him, and get this. Jesus, I don't know how many interactions you've had with physically blind folk, but oftentimes you can tell that folk are blind. Like physically, you can see the manifestation of blindness. But I find it interesting that when Jesus walks up to Bartimaeus, the question that he asks is, "What do you want me to do for you?" Which, I mean, I feel like it'd be obvious, right? If you have a blind dude who's begging, he wants to see so that it alters his life, reinstates him into community, and he can flourish better, right? But Jesus asks the question, "What do you want me to do for you?" And Bartimaeus' answer is, "Lord, I want to see." And so for those of us who are confused, we've been groomed into blindness. The systems of that whiteness have created demand our blindness. Many of us are beginning to wake up to it. It's not just the premature extinguishing of Black lives by law enforcement in the streets. We're beginning to wake up to like the systems and structures of institutionalized racism that exist at Point Loma, that exist in your workspaces, that exist all in your cities, in your neighborhoods. It exists all around. You're beginning to wake up. You're beginning to see it a little bit. My question is, are we as white folk willing to make a clown out of ourselves to get the attention of the sight healer? Because the good news is that Jesus healed sight before, and he continues to heal sight today. I believe that Jesus continues to pull up to us as white folk and says, "Hey, what do you want me to do for you?" My answer daily is, "Lord, I want to see. I want to see more clearly. I'm desperate to be able to see you, myself, others in the world around me more accurately." And there's all sorts of experiences that can help with that. But Spirit, I need you to be the one that continues to heal my sight. The third passage I want to lift up is that moment when Jesus crosses over the Sea of Galilee and he moves into a space with a man who's demon possessed with, quote, the legion of demons. And what I think is fascinating here is that in this interaction with this demon-possessed person, Jesus understands that legion is many. Like there are many spirits that are there are many manifestations of evil that oppress this individual. And I think that's true about whiteness. I think there are many, many, many manifestations of the demon of whiteness that oppress us, maybe even occupy us. And I think what's interesting here is in this interaction, this exorcism, this moment of liberation, Jesus asks the demon for its name, and the demon says, "My name is Legion, for I am many." And when the demon named itself, it began to lose its power. And I'm at a place right now in my journey with whiteness where I'm beginning to recognize that the power of whiteness is not just a matter of ignorance. It's not just like, if I learn more, it will go away. I'm also beginning to recognize that it's not like an appendectomy, that if I learn enough, then like I can carve it out and it will be gone forever. That's not the way that it works. that whiteness, rather than a matter of ignorance, is actually a demonic force. It's a power and principality. And I think it's been the most significant, powerful power and principality that has roamed untamed, especially in this country for the past 400 years. I think that we need to start naming whiteness as a demon, and we need to begin figuring out what it means to become exorcised by this demon. Let's start to name it what it is: a power and a principality, believing that it will begin to lose its power. And then let's seek liberation from it. Again, recognizing that Paul writes in Ephesians 6 that the battles that we're engaging here are not against flesh and blood. They're against powers and principalities. It's not white people versus black people. There's powers and principalities in play that are duping us to engage in acts of violence and indifference for our own benefit and at the expense of others. So what can we do about all of this? And let's have a little bit of conversation. The first thing, I think we need to understand, interrogate, lament, and repent of whiteness. Understand, interrogate, lament, and repent of whiteness. There's 4 books that I want to raise up that I think will be really helpful in this regard. The first is Waking Up White by Debbie Irving, just a story of an East Coast privileged white lady who begins to recognize, whoa, I am white, and that means something. And it's her transformation, her pilgrimage in an understanding of whiteness. The second is a book called White Awake by a white faith leader in the Chicago area named Daniel Hill. And it's his story of waking up to whiteness and how he knowingly and unknowingly leveraged whiteness for his own personal benefit. The third is White Privilege. And this is a book by Robin DiAngelo. And it's a spicy book that really speaks to what I was talking about at the very beginning, that when white folk begin to uncover the realities of whiteness, there's a fragility that comes with it. We don't like what we discover when we do this work. White fragility helps us identify that, and then helps us build some resilience to actually stay in the conversation and not get all hot and bothered and eject from it. The fourth book, and I think it's in this progression, is a book called So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. And I think that if we read Waking Up White, White Awake, White Privilege, we're actually ready to have a conversation about race that helps us understand how it actually plays out in the world that we live in. And I think Oluo does an unbelievable job in that particular book. So understand, interrogate, lament, and repent of whiteness is really super important. I want to just point out that I'm not shaming us who are white here. We heard Oshita say the same thing, like, God made me this way, right? I have to figure out what it means that I live in a world shaped by whiteness that's been designed by people who look like me, for people who look like me, at the expense of people who do not, right? And so that's what I'm talking about here. So this isn't an invitation into shame, it's an invitation into liberation. Second thing I want to raise up is that we have to get proximate to sisters and brothers of color. The fact of the matter is they're exhausted by us, rightly so. And they can't afford to wait for our learning curve because their folk are dying in the streets right now. Right. And so an invitation to get proximate to sisters and brothers of color is not an opportunity to draw up next to folk and say, hey, tell me about your experience of not being white in America. Because fact of the matter is, especially for our Black sisters and brothers, our migrant sisters and brothers, our Indigenous sisters and brothers, our Asian sisters and brothers, like being non-white in America is a traumatic experience. I'm talking about cultivating authentic relationships. And in order to do that, we have to build relationships at their pace, not ours. So our urgency, we're hot and bothered and we want to learn and all the things, great. Build relationship at their pace, not yours. Build trust at their pace, not yours. Gain their perspective by listening longer than feels comfortable to them. Demonstrate that you've heard them and you're making some behavior modifications based on what they're saying to you. Have some resilience when they look at you, give you the side eye and say, man, that's white Jer showing up in this moment, right? Have some resilience, press in, get curious in that moment. And over time, they're going to begin to commission you as a white ally. They're going to begin to see you as a co-creator in remaking the world that we all want to live in. My third bit is leverage your shared power to remake the world. Fact of the matter is, a lot of power and privilege comes with being white, and I can't give that away. I can leverage it. And so a couple of ways that I can leverage it as a white individual is that I can hold my family and friends accountable. When I hear the microaggressions and I hear the racism, when I hear them talk about their rationale behind votes, and when I hear them reflect on theology in a way that's diminishing the image of God in other people, it's my responsibility to hold them accountable. Don't shy away from those moments. Press in, because there's a moment of transformation that's potential there. Secondly, hold your leaders accountable. Hold your professors accountable. What's your reading list look like in your classes right now? If your reading lists are not wildly diverse, hold your professors accountable to that. If they're not bringing in perspectives of non-white and even non-Christian thought leaders and scholars and practitioners, hold them accountable to that. If their views seem rigid and limited by whiteness, respectfully hold them accountable. Ask them bigger questions. Like, you, the youth, you're the ones that are going to drive the change, right? It's your turn to do this. And so do it with generosity and respect, but do it with courage, with confidence, with boldness, because we have to hold our leaders accountable. And the last thing I want to raise up in terms of leveraging our power to remake the world is that we have to vote. We have to vote, especially right now. And we have to vote not based on our interests, but vote based on the interests of those who have been marginalized and terrorized by the systems and the policies that we have benefited from for 400 years. This is the value of having the relationships with our BIPOC relatives. What's their vote? You have some undocumented brothers and sisters. You've got some DACA sisters and brothers who they've got a voice, but they don't have a vote. If I'm you and I'm of voting age, I'm pulling up next to them and saying, how can I leverage my vote in a way that's going to benefit you? And do so. I think that's a way that we can leverage that. So understand, interrogate, lament, repent of whiteness, get proximate to sisters and brothers of color, and leverage our shared power to remake the world. Okay. Fire hydrant is now concluded. I think Sam's going to come on and we'll have a little bit of conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I know there's some good information in there for all of us. So we're going to open up for a little bit of a Q&A, and I can see some of the questions coming through right now. So we have a few questions here. We're going to try and bunch up some of the similar questions. So if I don't read your question exactly like you wrote it, somebody else probably wrote something similar, and we're gonna try and get to it. So I guess I will start with there's some question that's come through. I guess depicting, is it not hypocritical to say racism only comes from white people when everybody, race has to do with everyone? So basically, speak on the concept of reverse racism.
Yeah. I mean, good question. I mean, I think it's hard for me as a white male to reflect on reverse racism. What I want to do, and push me on it, Sam, in a second, but like, I also see this idea of like, what about the Chinese with regard to the Uyghurs and things like that? Yes, I think historically in the world, there have been people groups who exercise different forms of domination over other people groups. Absolutely. Like, I'm not, my expertise in area of research isn't necessarily in what's happening with the Uyghur folk right now. Yet what I'm watching is that there is a fear on behalf of the Chinese people. There's a cynicism and a skepticism around the Muslim religion, and the idea that you can be fully Chinese and Muslim. And so much of what I see happening there is a re-educate, like these concentration camps are literally an attempt at re-education, which is a form of violence, which is a form of dominance, which is a form of cultural genocide. Right. And I'm not saying that that's not also an expression of racism. In this particular conversation, I think it's important to elevate that the construct of race and the construct of racism was actually formally put together during the Enlightenment period in a white empire. And it raised up white-hued bodies in a color-coded system over people of color with black-hued bodies always occupying the basement, right? And so, like, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that the construct of racism that we're talking about and that we're struggling through as a country, and I think as a world, formally came to shape during the Enlightenment era in Britain. So that's kind of where I'm at. Like, do white folk experience racism against other, like, by non-white people, I have a hard time with that because racism is an abuse of power. So if race is a desire for self-interest, the accumulation of power, abundance, wealth, and I'm going to weaponize the tone of skin in order to get what I want. Like even if I'm feeling hatred by a person of a different color, animosity toward a person of different color, I still have the power in the relationship. Yeah. In culturally speaking, this person can't, like, short of killing me, this person can't do anything to me. But if I want to pick up a phone, like if that person wants to pick up a phone and call the police will automatically side with me. If I want to pick up the phone and call the police will automatically side with me. And it could be lethal for this person. Right. So I just, the idea of reverse racism to me seems like a misunderstanding of what racism really is.
Yeah, and you're absolutely correct. I think a lot of times we confuse personal, like individual racism with institutional or systemic racism. And, you know, as we were talking, the example that comes to mind is what happened in Central Park with Amy Cooper, right? That white woman knew the systems in place that if I call the police officer and I say my life is in danger because a black man, and she was very specific to say, a black man is threatening my life right now.
Yeah.
Those systems in place make it a little bit harder for me to envision people of color being racist towards white people. Now, that's not saying that white people don't experience prejudice, right? Those like I thought it's a different thing, right? White people can experience prejudice or stereotype, right? You know, the stereotype, white people can dance, right? That's a stereotype, right? They can experience that hurt from that, and that's not right either. But the stereotyping and prejudice are very different, very different from racism. Another question that kind of came up, and someone asked, basically, what is the difference between race and ethnicity, right? What I think that the term is, if I'm proud of who I am, how is that racism? So if I'm white and I'm proud to be white, is that racism?
Right. Good. Yeah, and that's I'm actually in a new learning journey, getting connected with my own ethnic identity. Right. Because one of the things that I said in defining whiteness is that within whiteness, ethnicity is optional. Right. So like Sam, how would you identify your ethnicity?
So for me, I am African. I'm Ghanaian. Right?
Ghanaian. Right.
Ghanaian, yeah.
Right. And so
go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. So like, that's what I'm saying. Like I in my relationships with my BIPOC colleagues and friends, there is a deep affection among most of them for their ethnic identity. Even my African-American friends, right? Like my African-American friends, the journey that they're going on recently, and I've watched this over the last probably 5 to 7 years, is getting more deeply in touch with the roots of their ancestors, right? Because they're sick of their lineage being tied to the plantations in the South. Their ancestors, the lineage actually unjustly crossed an ocean, and they're Ghanan, they're Ugandan, you know. And so with regard to ethnicity, I think it's interesting. Like I'd be cautious to folk who are like, yeah, I want to be proud to be white. Like I'm not saying like, yeah, don't be proud to be white, but like, what does that even mean? Like, what does like white? Germans weren't white a few hundred years ago. Italians weren't white because we actually wanted to diminish them and put them in a lower class when they made their way over to the United States, right? So they had to figure out how they could posture themselves to achieve whiteness. Whiteness is not an ethnicity. So I am Nordic American. And so the journey that I'm on right now is getting back in touch with my ancestral roots to the Nordic traditions. And not only like in like family tree stuff, but like, what were the rituals of the Nordic people? What was the spirituality of the Nordic people? What was the disposition of and as I do this work, it's helping me understand myself more. Now, I don't introduce myself as Nordic American quite yet, but I could see a moment in time where savvy white people who are doing the work and are in touch with their ethnic identities recognize, begin to identify ourselves as, I'm Nordic American, like my buddy Ben might say. Formerly, I'm African American. Now he'd say he might be consider himself Ghanaian American, at some point. So that's how I would distinguish those things.
Yeah, and again, very, very astute. I was thinking of W.E.B. Du Bois. Kind of talk about this psychological wage of whiteness. How this concept of race and color, skin color, kind of came about when the rich white, right, wanted to have total control over the Africans. This is before they were Black, they were Negroes, so however you want to call them. A way for these white people, rich white people, to kind of exert power was to convince the poor white that, hey, let's come together because you're like me, and let's lord over these people.
Yeah.
Call ourselves white. Let's stop calling ourselves Germans, Italians, English, Irish, right? Before then, those were all very separate groups of people. How many times have the Irish fought the English? How many times have the Germans fought almost everybody else, right? And it's kind of this concept of this is a social construct. Right, this is a social construct that has been kind of seeped into our society, and we need to look at our ethnicity, look at where we come from. And when I talk to people a lot, and I say I'm Ghanaian, some people are taken aback, and you're not African American. I'm like, well, I'm not African American.
Yeah.
I wasn't born here. I wasn't raised here. Born in Ghana, and I came here. So, yeah, it's extremely. I love.
Yeah, Sam, and I think we see this too in the 2020 census, right? Like there is a priority in our country to maintain a white majority. And so one of the ways in which that happened in the 2020 census is that Middle Easterners were now included in the distinction of white. And that's never happened before, right? And in the consciousness of US Americans, and especially US American Christians, Middle Easterners are not white. Not from 9/11 forward, they are dangerous, exotic, dark-skinned enemies. But for the sake of the census, because we're terrified of the thought of an America that is not predominantly white, we're now going to distinguish Middle Easterners as white so that we can hit the quota. It's fascinating.
It's awesome. I really appreciate it. I know we're running a little bit out of time. Just the last question here. What is the best way to explain to another white person that they can be involved or complicit in a racist system without them getting defensive and assume I'm calling them racist?
Beautiful question. Beautiful question. I mean, for me, I break open my life. I am very, very comfortable with understanding and communicating that racism lies within me. It's ingrained into my humanity. It's in the form of your story, like the form of what you're learning and what you're waking up to, in a way that doesn't position you as elitist or entitled, but rather as somebody who is waking up to some realities that are pretty important. And so I think you land it in your own story, and you invite them into the journey, and honestly, like the moment that a person feels like you're calling them racist is a moment that they're going to disengage. I would just constantly invite people to recognize that my perspective, I love to dupe myself into believing that my perspective is 20/20 vision. And it's not. I have a very, very, very small slant on things as they really are, and I think what in this journey, and especially as we're inviting other people into it, talk about how your vision is expanding a little bit. Don't be afraid to tell stories of how you're stumbling forward and mistakes you're making along the way. I think that's invitational. I think that's disarming. And I think that invites people into the journey with you.
Cool. I know we're kind of close to time, and I think time has already passed. There are some questions that I really think we got to keep the conversation going. So if you have somewhere you need to be, that's great, that's fine. You can leave, but we're gonna, if it's okay with you, I can continue asking you a few questions. And this is being recorded, and we'll email you the video and everything. So there's some questions on here that I really feel like it would be good to kind of tackle here. So the next question, and I kind of want to read it so I don't take it out of context while I read it. So the Europeans spent the last 2,000 years slowly developing technology to the point where they were able to conquer other cultures and people easily. Couldn't the atrocities of the last 400 years be avoided if peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Americas did the same?
Interpret that question for me, Sam.
Well, basically, if I'm understanding this, I don't know who wrote this, but basically, why is it a fault of the Europeans? Well, the place we are right now, why is it their fault? They were just living their life. They were just doing what they wanted to do. They built their own industry, and I kind of want to answer this a little bit, or maybe kind of take a stab at it. And whoever wrote this question, thank you for writing this question. It's interesting to me when we talk about how Europeans have built, developed technology and did all that. If you study the history of America, America was built for white people on the back and sweat of of slaves, mostly African slaves. In 2018, I had the opportunity to go with a few faculty and staff and some students, and we did a civil rights pilgrimage. And it was so much for me as an African who didn't grow up in this culture, coming in and kind of studying this history and really diving deep into it. I learned so much. The technological advancement, the industrial movement, what made America great, to borrow someone's favorite words, right? What made America great was this sweat of the African slaves. So it's always hard for me to kind of see or justify this and say, well, they did this and they worked hard to get to where they are, and this group didn't work hard to get to where they are. So this, I don't know. I have a hard time kind of diving into that.
Yeah. And maybe the person who wrote this question, if they're still on, could offer a little bit of clarification, because the way I'm reading the question is like, technology developed over 2,000 years to conquer. Couldn't the atrocities of the last 400 years be avoided if Africa, Asia, and America has developed technology to conquer too? So I don't know that I fully understand the question. So if you're still on, hit us again. That we want to get to that.
That'd be great. Well, okay, so let me see what else is on here. There's this one. So is our judicial system really tainted by a race suppressing framework, or are there just too many bad apples pulling the strings to oppress minorities?
Yeah, I mean, interesting question. I live in Oregon, and we were the last state in the union to have trial by juries. They didn't have to be unanimous. They had the juries were 12 people, and there had to be 10 votes in favor of a particular verdict, right? And that's because when the world began to shift a little bit and integrate in some ways, all of a sudden the pressure in Oregon was for people of color to be included in juries because they never were before. But then the workaround on that is we're going to include at least 2 people of color on each jury, but now we're going to change that. We don't actually need to have a unanimous vote. Now it can be 10-2 and the ruling will or the verdict will stand, right? And so I mean, and again, speaking to the state of Oregon, the system by which district court judges are appointed and how these slots are filled and everything, it's all dependent upon a system built by whiteness in order to maintain a power system of whiteness in those places of control and authority, right? And so, I mean, I'm not sitting here saying like, wow, our entire judicial system is totally wonky and everything about law enforcement is totally wonky. I do think, though, we have to think about the history, like the roots of these systems, and what were they built upon? How do you have a just justice system that talks about justice for all when we also had in our Constitution that there are some people who actually aren't included in the all because they're not really human? Mm-hmm. Right. And so then when they're placed on trial, even to this day, the DNA of that stuff continues to show up in our current systems, right? Or, take it off the judicial, put it into the policing. The history of policing, especially in the South and as it migrated north, was slave patrol, right? And their job was to hunt down runaway slaves, capture them, return them, and then terrorize them in front of everybody so that they can control people. That's the history of policing in America, right? And so the fact that we have a law enforcement system made up predominantly of white folk, but in my experience in protests around the country, whether it's Ferguson or Portland or what happened in Bend, Oregon just about 3 weeks ago, the black cops are the ones that are the hardest to actually interact with, because they've had to actually break rank with their with a form of their human identity in order to aspire to declare their loyalty to their blue colleagues, right? So the things that they have to do to prove themselves worthy to wear the badge and the blue uniform, man, it's fascinating watching my black neighbors interact with black cops, right? And so the fact that law enforcement is prematurely extinguishing black lives in the streets of our cities, and we're catching it on camera, and we hardly are moved by it anymore, that's not a new thing. That's the system actually continuing to work itself out as it was designed to work itself out. So yeah, I think this stuff is tainted in the direction of injustice, especially toward our BIPOC relatives. And we're the ones who vote the city councilors into their positions and the city managers into their positions, who hire and fire chiefs of police. We're the ones who vote our sheriffs into their places of power and authority and can vote them out, right? And so like this is where we actually have to figure out, how do we begin to build some power, leverage the votes to actually begin to see this system begin to change,
Cool. Absolutely. Thank you, Jer. Last question. I think that's the last question we have here. And so someone said the Smithsonian had a list of whiteness as part of its African American Museum exhibit, and it included things like the nuclear family, planning for the future, and rational lineage thinking. Are these traits not present in other cultures, or do the traits just get moved into whiteness, specifically Asian cultures who put an emphasis on many of these traits?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I mean, I didn't know that there's an exhibit on whiteness in the African American Museum. I would love to see it. What I think is interesting in that regard is whiteness as the norm, whiteness as the standard, right? Like you think about talking about the nuclear family, for example, like these old black and white shows, that depict the nuclear family, and not just as an ideal for other white folk, but as like the ideal, as like, this is the way it's supposed to be, and so are these traits. I mean, you think about, my wife is Germanic American. You think about Nordics and Germans probably more so than Nordics. They are a very linear thinking group of people. I mean, that's why they build BMWs and Mercedes, and they're like some of the best cars in the world, right? They're the way that they think about systems and structures and order and precision is kind of ingrained into that culture. That doesn't mean that it doesn't also exist in the Japanese culture, nor the Ghanaian culture. Maybe it expresses itself differently, but yeah, those things seem to be very much so there. What I'm intrigued by in this regard is whiteness and how it was elevated as a norm, and how it continues to be elevated as a norm, even to this moment.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, I haven't seen that list before. I think it would be really cool to be able to see that. Well, I'm gonna end it here. And again, for those of you who are still on, we are really unpacking this, and this is I want to emphasize that this is not a last one-off. We are really going to be diving deep into this in the coming months, in the coming years. I know Point Loma is very dedicated to becoming an anti-racist campus, and the administrators and the higher ups are working hard to try and kind of bring this unity and diversity on our campus. So you're going to hear more from us. You're going to hear more about this event. I'm going to hand it over to Director of CJR, Kimberly Jones, and to close this out. But before I do that, I want to say thank you to Jer. You're amazing. You're awesome. A good friend to have. Look him up, visit him. He has a wealth of knowledge and very welcoming. So thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Take over, Kim.
Thank you so much, Jer, for giving us your time and your wisdom and sharing your heart and your experience with us. It was really impactful. And thank you to everyone for being here. I know not everyone could stay for the whole time, but it was an honor to host this tonight. And like Sam said, we're committing to this not being the only conversation. So stick with us as we navigate this and figure out together how to open up space so that people feel heard and people can continue to learn. And just so you know, you can get Chapel and Intercultural Pathways credit. If you're here tonight, you can do that. So we will be emailing out a recording of tonight along with resources. So I know a lot of you were trying to take notes as fast, but I don't think it's possible to take notes as fast as Jared talks. So we are sending out resources to everybody as a follow-up, and we look forward to having you again. Please sign up for next month. We're going to look at how exploitation actually is impacted by how racism even plays into exploitation, and the diversity of the exploited. It's going to be a really interesting discussion talking with lived experience experts that we work with at the center. So look forward to having you sign up for that. You can sign up through watching us on social media or through Googling Cup of Culture on the searching Cup of Culture on the Point Loma website. And that is it. So we will end tonight. And again, thank you everyone for being here. Just really super thankful to have you join us, Jer.